Welcome back to the Dean Obeidallah Show. Right now, David Henderson is joining us again. Former prosecutor in Texas. He was in the DA's office, tried over 70 cases to verdict. Now he works on civil cases, human trafficking, capital murder, criminal defense, and more. David, nice to see you. Thank you for being here.
Hey, Dean, good to see you too. Thanks for having me.
Sure. So obviously, there's no court today. The state's case is almost done, but you've served as a prosecutor. You tried so many cases, and I want to get your reaction to Michael Cohen. Of course, we can't see it. I mean, we're really based on reporting, and I wish we had video of all of this trial. But what is your take on the cross-examination of Michael Cohen by Trump's attorney?
I think the cross-examination, to bottom line it, is not effective. And I don't know why they've taken the approach they have. Overall, this is the type of cross-examination you provide when you want to be emotional during cross-examination and you just want to tear at someone, but that's not the most effective way to connect with the jury. But let me dial this back and say that it's been really interesting watching this trial for all the reasons you just cited, because if you ask me, do I think former President Trump did it? My answer is yes, I do. If you ask me, do I think there's proof beyond a reasonable doubt that he did it in the courtroom? My answer is no, and that turns largely on the testimony of Michael Cohen.
So it does. And was that because of Michael Cohen even before the cross-examination? Or so can you explain a little?
Absolutely. I'm trying to limit myself to what I actually see inside the courtroom, which is really difficult with this case because you've got former President Trump making comments outside the courtroom. You've got all these discussions like between you and I right now happening outside the courtroom. But here's the difficulty for me. First of all, no trial lawyer worth their salt would intentionally leave two lawyers on their jury. And the reason why, I've been thinking about it, why don't we like juries? Why don't we like lawyers on the jury? Here's what it comes down to. It's like the Wizard of Oz with Dorothy. She walks up, pulls the curtain back, and exposes the wizard. Lawyers are capable of doing that. So number one, what I have to tell myself is we keep hearing all this talk about corroborating evidence, but at the end of the day, you have to believe Cohen to convict on felonies. And it took you 2 weeks to bolster your star witness enough to feel comfortable putting him on the witness stand. And despite the fact that I think the cross-examination has been bad, there are two things he testified about that would be sticking in the back of my mind. Mm-hmm. Number one, no lawyer records their own client. I just haven't heard of a lawyer doing that before. And then the explanation I expect to be, well, you're covering yourself because your client's doing something crazy, which is bad. But then Cohen's explanation is, no, I did it so that I'd have a recording that I could play for David Pecker to reassure him that he was going to get paid and also to keep him loyal. That's exactly what the defense is claiming you did with Stormy Daniels, although they have not cross-examined on that point, and that baffles me. In addition to that, you have him on record saying that, you know what, the facts of my prosecution for tax evasion may have been accurate, but I thought it was a wrongful prosecution. And then when you cross-examine him on statements that he's made publicly outside of court, they go far beyond that. But what the defense hasn't done is explained why that matters. So, Dean, when someone steps up to take a plea in criminal court, the judge will ask, have you reviewed the records? Have you reviewed the facts? Are those things true? You have to say yes. The judge will ask, are you guilty because you are guilty and for no other reason? You have to say yes. And you have to sign your name multiple times. So if I'm cross-examining Cohen, I would walk through all of those things that he has to confess and say, yes, 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 I signed this, I did this, I agreed to this. Then the question becomes, then why would you come back and say that none of this was right, that it was wrongful, that it shouldn't have happened in the first place? And I think what you force him to acknowledge is he did it because it was in his best interest at the time, which is also what the defense is trying to argue. But I don't think they've done a good job of raising any of those issues on cross-examination.
So, look, no one knows what a jury is going to do. That's a cliche, but it's true. We don't know how it's going to end. I assume there's going to be more Michael Cohen cross on Monday. We know that. We know there'll be redirect. Yeah. What do you expect to hear in terms of redirect by the prosecution?
If I was on the prosecution team, I would not redirect on Michael Cohen. I don't think it gets any better than it already is. And the defense hasn't punched any holes. From the first question, they started off with personal attacks. And these were the lawyers asking about personal attacks that Michael Cohen made on them, which has no persuasive relevance or authority in the courtroom. They have meandered so much, I think they've lost their way on cross-examination. So the only point in redirecting is because you think something is going to get better. I don't think it can get better for the state, and that reflects how poor of a job I think the defense is doing on cross.
I was so stunned when Todd Blanche opened with, "You said this about me." And the only thing I could think about, and I was reading, this is only his second criminal defense trial, that he's used to being a prosecutor, right? And
Right.
if you were to attack a prosecutor, it might make the jury go like, wow, this person has no respect for the system whatsoever. That's the only thing I'm trying to make sense of it, like you are.
No,
I only tried a few cases, like nothing else made sense to me because I'm like, does he think the jury's going to like, oh, they've liked Todd Blanche that so much that you're so mean, you attacked me? I don't know what the point. And there was an objection. It was sustained right then.
it was. And the judge pulled him up by sidebar and asked, "What are you doing? Why are you
Yeah,
making this about yourself?" Here's what I think it comes down to, Dane. We live in a day and age where lawyers don't really go to court anymore. Heaven forbid one of your listeners has to go to court. You've got a lawyer sitting next to you. It wouldn't be shocking for the lawyer to turn and say, "Hey, just so you know, I've never done this before."
wow.
Since we don't go to court as much anymore, we don't know how to behave in court. And I think a lot of the cues that we get, we take from the movies. And in the movies, you're hard and you're mean and you're firm on cross-examination. If I was watching Cohen testify, and bear with me, I hope that my point of view here is accurate overall. Like when you invite me on, I always want to give you my honest take on what I'm
Sure.
saying. And my instinct as a lawyer always is to worry about what the other side could be doing, should be doing. And that's the way I'm evaluating this cross-examination. If I'm sitting there about to cross Michael Cohen, the first thing I'm noticing, the first thing is the prosecution is asking him a lot of leading questions. They're asking him leading questions, and they're doing an exaggerated job of corralling him. That tells me that he tends to wander when he answers and he's anxious to talk. If you ask me overall what this cross-examination has done, it's the same problem as Stormy Daniels. They've put Cohen on familiar territory the same way they did with Stormy Daniels. The way you cross Cohen is you start off by letting him brag about how hard he worked for former President Trump, about how proud he was to be part of that team. And you're indirectly inviting him to expand upon all the answers that he's already provided. Once he starts rattling on, he won't be able to help himself. And you'll be able to demonstrate for the jury how far he will go to tell you how great he is despite his history. Then you start hitting him with that history. And it goes something like this. "Hey, I want to go back to that recording that you made back in 2016. Just want to make sure I understand because it's not clear to me. Former President Trump didn't know you were recording him when you made that recording, did he? He didn't know you're making a recording, and you made that recording to put it to use for something that he was not aware of, right? He didn't know you're going to go show this to Pecker, did he?" And then you ask, so it is true that at times you took it upon yourself to fix things. That's what you called yourself, as fixer.
Right.
You took it upon yourself to fix things without his knowledge. He has to say yes because he just testified to that, and that hurts him. If he says no, you catch him being dishonest in front of the jury, and that hurts him even more. But that's how you handle the cross, not with these personal attacks and this, berating back and forth. That's what you do when your client says, "I can't stand this guy, and I want you to beat him up, just annihilate him on the stand." And if I was there sitting at the counsel table, I'd lean over and ask, "Hey, are we trying to win this trial? Or are we just trying to make a point?" Like, honestly, man, I can't tell. And I'm not clear what the answer would be in response to my question.
I've spoken to other lawyers this week who said that they really feel Trump is just on top of Blanche and pressing him to do his bidding the exact way he wants. I'm chatting with David Henderson. So look, Michael Cohen is we'll use a term of art, a sleazeball, right? He's pled guilty. He's pled guilty to lying to Congress. He is a liar. He bragged. He was a bully. I thought that was actually pretty good by the state. Him saying it was fantastic. I lied. I bullied. It was all for Trump. I did it all for that guy right there. Look, as a former prosecutor, I'm sure you had key witnesses who were sleazy too, who had priors as well. And does that stand in the way of getting a conviction, or do juries go like, sometimes you need a sleazy criminal type of guy to catch other criminals?
Dean, it depends. And this
Okay.
is why, down here in Texas, we get a lot of things wrong, but we're good at producing trial lawyers and football players for whatever reason. And down here, we say that trial law is an art, not a science. Sometimes it just matters how it feels when it comes across. And let me tell you why that's so important here, because it may sound like some of my opinions are based on just that. My opinions are a bit more objective than that, because no one can tell you what constitutes reasonable doubt. Everybody decides for themselves. You can say it's the highest legal burden. That is true. But at the end of the day, the law cannot say what constitutes reasonable doubt. It's what you conclude is enough evidence. And so there's no way around this. If you look at the case that the state has built, they can tell you when the phone calls happen. They can tell you who was in the room and conversations occurred. when it all comes down to it, you have to take Michael Cohen's word for exactly what was said and how that impacts the case. And therefore, when you've got a case, it comes down to that. You have to have a witness where somehow you can bolster what they're saying in that context. Normally, it comes from specific details they provide, like Stormy Daniels did. You would only know those things if you're actually in the room. And then the only question becomes, do you believe her based on what she's saying? I don't think Cohen's testimony rises to that level. So do you sometimes have to put people who are troubling on the stand? Yes, but what they've managed to do, what the prosecution managed to do effectively, and I have mixed feelings about this overall, I have to be honest with you, is they've effectively euphemized Michael Cohen being a liar. I mean, he's lied in so many different contexts that you've lost track of how substantial some of the lies are, and the defense hasn't done a good job of pointing that out for the jury. But I find myself wondering, in good conscience, could I ask someone to convict an individual based on the testimony of Michael Cohen, based on what I've seen and heard in this trial? And I can't say the answer is yes.
And if I remember correctly, I was reading Mark Pomerantz's book, who came as a special counsel, so to speak, in the Manhattan DA's office. And I think Cy Vance had real problems, a former prosecutor, former DA, with building a case around Michael Cohen, and for obvious reasons. And it's not just the convictions, because people who are have felony convictions can be believable, but it was all about Michael Cohen, the whole picture of the guy. And he is going as a different version of Michael Cohen than people knew. I interviewed him about his book a year ago. Yeah. And I felt like he was punching me during the interview. Like, I mean, it was like, what we were by Zoom, but he was a pit bull in the interview. And I'm trying to help him sell his book. And we never got contentious, but it was like right beneath the surface. And it's like almost like, rrr. I was like, wow, now he's being really calm. His normal state. And my friend, Brian Karam, who comes on the show all the time, wrote his book, Revenge, spent 6 months with him and said, look, there are times Michael is like the guy you're seeing on the stand. There are times Michael is a pit bull. So it's not like he created this character. There is a character he puts out there in the public, but there is another Michael Cohen, and we're going to see how it plays out. So do you think the defense will call anybody? I mean, I heard rumors of a Federal Election Commission sort of expert, but I'm not even sure.
I expect them to. You know, former President Trump said he was going to take the stand. And it's very difficult for me to set aside my personal feelings. But if what you have is Cohen testifying about the content of conversations, and then former President Trump testifies differently, you've got one person's word versus the other, and by definition, that can constitute reasonable doubt. I think that given how they put this defense on, it behooves them to put somebody up on the stand to provide some narrative that the jury is going to be struck with when they go back there and they start testifying. But, you know, I also want to hit another point, because the way you were just talking about Cohen puts in perspective the way the cross-examination should be going. We talked about the phone call. We talked about him saying, I have been untruthful indirectly, even in the context of taking a plea agreement in federal court. But then also the book deal, he's made a lot of money off of these books. So he has a financial incentive for the testimony he's providing on the stand. And I would ask him that question very politely. You've grossed $3.4 million off these books, right? And then this is not a straight up legal question, but I would imply to the jury, and you're going to make more money if my client gets convicted, aren't you? There's going to be another book about this trial. You're going to keep profiting. That's an incentive to alter your testimony. But these things haven't come up so far. It's hard for me to know what the defense is doing, to be completely frank with you.
That's interesting for you to say that. Someone who's tried cases as a prosecutor and defense attorney to say that.
I don't get it. Here's the reason why. And I want to pick up on something else that you highlighted just a minute ago. What you don't want to do with a witness is put them on familiar territory, right? So you're talking about what Cohen's personality has been like when you've testified, when you've interviewed him
about his book. He was selling his book, and I felt like I was on trial.
So let me ask you, what do you think Michael Cohen's expectations are when he takes the stand and the defense cross-examines him? What do you think he's expecting? He's expecting to come at him hard, right?
Right, exactly.
So why would you do that? Why would you treat him the way he's prepared for you to treat him? And the reason I say it connects with Stormy Daniels, it doesn't matter what someone thinks of Stormy Daniels personally. It doesn't matter what you think of Stormy Daniels' occupation. The one thing I can tell you for sure, she has endured every slander, every mean name, every attempt to shame her. That is familiar territory for her. So when she starts off on direct examination, she's talking fast, she feels nervous, she just feels a bit unsure of herself. But then on cross-examination, when you start attacking her, Stormy's like, I've lived through this every day of my life. This is home for me. And that's when she really starts to shine. So the way you should cross-examine her is you be polite to her. You be respectful to her. I would have made jokes. Miss Daniels, I got to give you a heads up. My wife said she's going to read this transcript, so I'm going to be on my best behavior. She won't be able to help but laugh at that. And then once you start talking to her in friendly tones, you'll get much better testimony out of her because you're being respectful. When you start coming at them hard and aggressively, they're prepared for that. And that's their world, not yours.
I so appreciate, based on your experience, sharing with me and the audience this insight here. If what we know from the reporting is on yesterday, the judge said to the lawyers, be prepared for closings on Tuesday, right? So obviously the defense attorney, he said that we're going to make a decision on witnesses, and they can say we're going to call Donald Trump. But if you're saying be prepared on Tuesday, I would imagine at this point the defense is not saying they're going to have Donald Trump, because if Donald Trump testifies, that's going to be days of testimony. Cross-examination is going to be days of testimony. So it really seems like that Donald Trump is not going to be called. It could change, but it doesn't seem like right now they're going to call.
Yeah, based on that, I think you're right. But here's what I think the judge is really doing. The judge is giving a heads up. Hey, I'm not going to let any delays occur. So be prepared to go as early as Tuesday, because he doesn't know what the defense is going to do. Right. So based on what we're seeing so far, if the defense doesn't call anyone after Cohen gets off the stand, I don't think the prosecution will be able to help themselves. They will cross-examine him. They will try to rehabilitate him. Then you're going to have what's called a charging conference. That's when you argue about what law the judge is going to read to the jury and tell them they have to follow during deliberations. That will at least occupy Monday. So there's a chance that Tuesday they could close. But I just think the defense will put somebody on the stand. It's hard for me to imagine that they won't. And the more interesting question would be, what would the defense do that would have maximum impact, which, again, I have not seen them do so far, but they'd have a puncher's chance if they did.
And a lot of people have called and asked, but I wanted to get you, as someone who's a former prosecutor and defense attorney, say Donald Trump, just assume he's convicted of numerous felonies, and people have called and go, well, do they take him right to jail then? And I said, no, they don't, as much as many of us would like to see that happen. Just so people understand what happens if he's convicted of even one felony up to 34 felonies, what will happen?
So the honest answer to your question is no one will know what to do if he's convicted. And the reason why is because lawyers, we are not creative people, and that includes judges. We're not used to dealing with things that we haven't seen before, and no one has seen this before. Now, with that in mind, you've also got to keep in mind these cases typically don't go to trial. People who get accused of crimes like this, do what Michael Cohen did, they plead guilty. So it's new for the judge, it's new for the prosecutors. However, people don't typically get jail time for first offenses like this. So what the judge will normally do is they'll release the person, they'll do some version of a pre-sentencing investigation. So the judge will have information about this person's background before he issues a sentence. She'll say, well, we already know everything, right? But that's not going to prevent him from ordering the investigation. That can take weeks.
And who does that, just so people know?
Typically, you've got an agency that's in charge of it, and it's a different agency in every state.
Sure, okay.
This is what we call pretrial services, and they'll take a look at your background, your criminal history, if there is one. They'll talk to people who are familiar with the crime. And that'll be complex here because it's not like you've got a victim like somebody who was assaulted, but they'll normally still put together a report that may be like a dozen pages for the judge to review. And based on that report, the judge will then provide sentencing. I think there's zero possibility that former President Trump gets any jail time. And part of what gets glossed over in these discussions is you couldn't send him to jail even if you wanted to. Jail is when you and I go to jail, heaven forbid, we're going to be in Gen Pop, and it's going to be the scariest experience of our life. If you send him to jail, it looks like something like Paulie serving time in the movie Goodfellas, because Secret Service is going to block off a wing for him. The most that would happen would be some version of home confinement. And at the same time, home confinement in the house I grew up in would be home confinement. Home confinement in a mansion, I don't think is really home confinement.
Stay in one room.
Exactly.
So the reality is that the judge will not render a sentence that day. It's going to be some kind of time afterwards. The lawyers will argue, I'm sure, by briefs, and they'll come in. And does the fact that Donald Trump is facing numerous felonies in 3 other jurisdictions come into what the judge will consider in terms of sentence?
I would argue that ethically the judge can't, because he hasn't been convicted of anything in jurisdiction yet. The other question would be, does he stack these sentences on top of each other? And the explanation, and by stack, I mean he's accused of doing this 34 different times. Does the judge say, hey, we're going to give you one sentence for all 34 counts? Or does the judge say you're going to serve one sentence for the first count, then a second sentence for the second count, 3, 4, 5 on down the line. I tried cases at a courthouse where I was in front of a judge that spent 30 years on the bench. He said, in 30 years, I've only stacked someone's sentences twice. And that was on both cases that I had worked on. And the facts there were far worse than the charges former President Trump is facing.
And just so people know, for each of the 34 felonies, the maximum is up to 4 years in jail, and it could be no jail. There's no minimum. So it could be nothing but a fine. And you already helped us by answering that you don't think there's going to be jail time. And he has no priors. He'll be a 78-year-old man in a few weeks. So it's unlikely recidivism of this. But then again, with Trump, you just never know. David, do you think in the last minute here, any of the other trials actually go forward before November?
Not a chance.
No.
And I didn't think there was a likelihood they would have from the beginning, to be honest with you, Dean. The only, like Judge Cannon has said, I'm suspending this indefinitely. I'm not even going to tell you when I get a trial date. They're steady trying to get Fani Willis removed from the case in Georgia, which will shut that down altogether if it happens. The only even theoretical possibility would be Judge Chutkan, because Judge Chutkan, when she gets the go-ahead, she's going to keep moving the same way she would in any other case. But the Supreme Court is going to slow her down from being able to take it to trial before November. So no, this will be it.
Well, David, thank you so much for spending time doing a wrap-up of this. We get into the last week of the trial. It's always great chatting with you and great seeing you on TV. And I look forward to chatting with you in the future.
Likewise. Thanks so much for having me, Dean.
Of course. Take care. Have a great weekend.